Let's talk about naming and shaming. Countries are often criticized on the global stage. And naming and shaming is a strategy in which governments are publicly criticized for violating international norms and laws. And it's actually a tactic that's used by a range of actors, including states, international organizations, non-governmental organizations, and even some individuals. So think of activists, for example. In October 2022 alone, 142 countries signed a UN resolution condemning Russia's war in Ukraine. 50 countries condemned China's treatment of Uyghurs, and 6 countries condemned human rights abuses in Ethiopia. How do global audiences react to these statements? Studying this phenomenon is particularly important, not only because it's widespread and has political implications, but also because it's often the only tool at our disposal when we think of global governance. There's no world government that can enforce the rules, so public shaming basically becomes the main enforcement mechanism. In my area of research of human rights, naming and shaming is very persistent, but similar dynamics also appear in other areas like climate governance or global health governance, and so understanding both the motives and the consequences of shaming is essential. Before my own work, most of this research was focused on outcomes within the targeted state and debated whether shaming leads to compliance with international norms or to a backlash effect. But if reputation is essentially what others think about you, the literature had very little to say about how shaming affects external perceptions. So to try and understand how naming and shaming affects reputation, I ran a study in the US with 6,000 respondents, and respondents were presented with information about arbitrary detention happening in one country, and then told that another country has criticized the government for engaging in this behavior. Targets and shamers were randomly selected from lists of US allies and US adversaries, and this made it possible to see how reactions change based on who is criticizing whom. After reading the scenario, respondents rated their favorability of the countries involved, how likely they are to support military cooperation and economic cooperation with the countries, and they also gave their own evaluation of support for human rights and for international law more broadly. The findings show that shaming can improve the shamer's reputation while harming the target's reputation. And criticism that comes from allies tends to be more persuasive, right? So you tend to believe your friends or trust your friends more so than you do your enemies. Ironically, allies actually gain less from engaging in shaming, in part because we already hold very favorable attitudes towards them, so it's more difficult to increase those favorable perceptions. And so what ends up happening, right, is that the countries that are more likely to persuade us are also the ones that reap the least benefits from engaging in shaming. And finally, shaming also increases support for human rights in third-party countries. And so countries that observe shaming happening in the world tend to become more supportive of the violated norms. So in this case, they were less supportive of arbitrary detention. So what can we learn from this study? One of the key takeaways is that shaming can shape global public opinion, but it is inherently political. Take the Israel-Hamas war, for example. Critics of Israel included US allies like European countries, Spain and Ireland, strategic allies like South Africa, and adversaries like China and Russia. And this research can help us explain the US public reaction to this criticism, and perhaps offer one explanation as to why we see such a drop in US public support for Israel since the beginning of the war. Governments and organizations that are trying to influence foreign behavior and use this tactic of naming and shaming need to consider who the target is, who the criticizer is, and who is watching. Because all three of these shape how persuasive the criticism is and who gains reputationally.